Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right, and it is once again proving out more true than ever before. And this is Tom Navolis, your host, and I am delighted to be here as I see my in-home producer smiling face looking at me is always a great delight. But all of you out there are going to get a chuckle or two today if you watched a YouTube. Not at all, because today we're talking about generations of promoted subversion. And as we get into this, I want to make clear right from the start that in reality, there's no federal law against subversion. So when the bureaucracies that have come into play, when you look at the environmental agencies, you look at the education agencies, you even look at the likes of, yes, Homeland Security and many other agencies that are now part of the federal government in an unconstitutional manner because, let's face it, the Anti-Federalists were right on this in talking about what? The federal government usurping the states and taking over full control and authority over you as individuals, making you, the citizens, nothing more than the minions of those that are what? The favorites within the swamp, and that can know where the alligator heads are, and that they can walk gingerly across those gators without taking and getting a leg bitten off. Well, here we are. We're going to talk about this and subversion. Now, I went to Noah Webster's dictionary and, yes, trying to figure out as we look at all these crazy things on critical race theory and the 1619 Project. I'm not going to talk about them necessarily in detail. What I want to get more into is that I found, interestingly enough, that the language and the root of those projects are subversive, are subversion, and I don't know if you could ever find an attorney that would ever look at both, and I'll talk about some Ohio code, that's the ORC's Ohio Revised Code, and the US Code in relationship to what the Anti-Federalists talked about when they used the words subversion and sedition. And interestingly enough, the Anti-Federalist, and one of the primary resources that I use for the Anti-Federalist papers, they only use sedition one time. But subversion is used quite often. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's get back to the dictionary. So here's what Noah Webster defines as subversion. And it again is in your notes. It's in the promotion. And you can find all of that over my shoulder at samueladamsreturns.net. Now, subversion is the entire overthrow, an overthrow of the foundation, utter ruin. And here's examples. As the subversion of a government or a state, the subversion of despotic power, the subversion of the Constitution or laws, the subversion of an empire. Overthrow, that whole idea of the overthrow of the foundations. Well, that's what critical race theory as well as the 1619 Project are all about, is overthrowing our foundation. Hence, from that basic definition, that's subversion. So let's take it a little bit more in that dictionary. as we look at subversive, tending to subvert, having a tendency to overthrow and ruin. Every immorality is subversive of private happiness. Are you getting that? I mean, come on. It is immorality is the subversion or of private happiness. So you have all the whack jobs out there, all of those that are claiming all these different rights and everything and saying it's all about their happiness when he says, wow. And then public corruption of morals is subversive of public happiness. Well, I'm going to let you chew on those. And again, those definitions are in the notes and in your minutes and notes and for the program for today. I just am always overwhelmed when we look at this. And John Locke even says as from subvert, the verb usage. This would subvert the principles of all knowledge. Subversion, immorality, subverts the principles even of all knowledge. Wow. Gosh, what do you do with all of that? All right, so let's go in here and take a dive into a few things, and then we're going to cover some interesting aspects of this past week and cover over some of the other pieces that I want to talk to you about relative to law itself. So let's jump over here and some of the things that were said by the anti-federalists, and we're gonna kind of dig into a really interesting article as well called "Radically Subversive Speech and the Authority of Law." But I want to say something from George Mason in particular. George Mason was a delegate to Philadelphia, and he refused to sign the Constitution. And you sit there and go, well, what? Well, there were a few delegates, Elbridge Gerry and others, who refused to sign the Constitution. And I'm going to tell you why in just a moment. Now I got your attention, right? And Mason says this about the Constitution and why he didn't sign it. It's totally subversive of every principle which has hitherto governed us. This power is calculated to annihilate totally the state governments. Wow, that was a guy that was there. I mean, we're going to go over a number of different portions here about the Anti-Federalist as well, but let's talk about just some general warnings that came out of the likes of the Federalist, of all people, in what they were saying. Here's Benjamin Franklin. I mean, he was talking about, and he was one of the foremost architects, in the structuring of the Constitution after Madison and the rest of the folks there. He goes, I agree to this Constitution, and I believe further that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years and can only end in despotism as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupt as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. You see, when we lose our morality, when the pulpits quit doing their jobs as they have over the last 100 years, and even especially now with all of this craziness that's happened with this whole COVID thing, and what has happened in letting education be taken over in the 40s and 50s by godless people, guess what? Boy, what a prediction that was from Ben Franklin, that, you know what? Sure, it could be administered well for a few years, but guess what? the despotism is going to come, and you're going to need then despots to take and rule over you. Washington warned as well. He says this. He says they serve to organize factions. And he was talking about all these political parties that would come about and what we have. And now with the two-party system in particular, this really plays into it, is that they serve to organize factions, to put in place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of a party. Often a small but artful and enterprising minority. Who runs the parties? It's not we the people. It's that small and enterprising minority, the lobbyists, all of the special interests, those types of influences that come along. He says, let me warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. He was prophetic in all that. It is most important that those entrusted with its administration confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department any encroachment upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create a real despotism. Now, we've seen that in particular around the courts, and we can go on and on around the courts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next segment, in that I'm going to talk about a paper here that's called Radically Subversive Speech and the Authority of Law, how law and the courts have allowed for the subversion to the extent now that our very liberty can only be controlled, as Franklin said, by despotism. And we've allowed that. The churches have allowed that, because when we go back to what is morality and what I talked about last week as to what religion is predominant, it's no longer Christianity. It's all about all of the evils, the isms, that have taken and perverted everything that we have that's going on. One of the other areas that occurred that we looked at sedition. When we look at subversion, we also have to look at sedition and what that is. And that is something that it was written, in print, uttered or published, any false, scandalous, and malicious writings of that, or into contempt, disrepute of the good people of the United States. We'll get into this a little bit deeper in the next couple of segments when we take a look at, even here in Ohio, what occurred, and a lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And when it went to the Supreme Court, it really opened the doors for both the sedition that we've seen, and as the title of this program is, the subversion that comes in and then allows sedition to prevail. In the last few seconds, what's sedition? Sedition quickly is the sense of the word where it's contrary to that which is naturally deducible, noting a rising or raging rather than an appeasing. But to set it, really, it throws down everything, it drives everything, everything rushes together by factions. It's tumultuous, men rising up in opposition to law or the administration of justice in disturbance of public peace. And we're going to get into that because now we have the Homeland Security, we have the Attorney General of the United States defining the terrorism all in relationship to the aspects of what I'm calling the critical race theory, and pointing everything to especially those people that were there on January 6th and looking at all of the all, not just the ones that stormed the Capitol, but all participants as being the most dangerous terrorist for the United States. So we've come a long way in what our founders intended for our liberties, and to the fact that we have allowed for decades subversion and we're accepting sedition, like in Portland, Oregon. Sam Adams knew the truth. The Anti-Federalists predicted the truth. Even Ben Franklin noted that. So come on back in the next segment as we follow up some more on this issue. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they did get it correct. They got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. And I just wanted to welcome everybody that's there at Liberty Works Radio Network. And as I do in this segment all the time, is just to remind you to please look at all of the other folks that are here all during the week, the live programming, and yes, find that donate button. And at the same time, I'd like to remind you to look over my shoulder if you're on YouTube, or at samueladamsreturns.net is where all of this programming is archived for you, and you can read all of the documentation for today's program is there. I'm just not pulling this out of my ear. It is all documented, and I give you every reference there at samueladamsreturns.net. When we left, I was talking about sedition, I was talking about subversion, because we've allowed the subversion to happen. We've allowed it to happen in our educational system. We've allowed to happen from the pulpits, not preaching the full gospel, as I talked about last week. So please go back to that program last week and understand what the new, understand what the new religion is in America, the state religion, which, once again, we're not supposed to have a state religion, but we do. And it's called evil. And that's just what it is. But, what other moral context is there? Pulpits aren't, for the most part. There's a number that are, so let me qualify that. There's a lot of pulpits that are out there. There's some here in Ohio now that I'm understanding that are taking that full perspective, as well as others across the country. But for the most part, the larger denominations and some of the independents, especially the Gospel Coalition crowd, they are not teaching the whole truth of what it means to be a Christian American. But with that, let's talk about sedition for a minute, because the Sedition Act was passed, and the whole idea of that was to, stop people from perverting our Constitution. But what we had is that Madison was one of the ones that denounced it. It was passed and then it was overturned, but Madison said that it was it denied the First Amendment, guarantees of freedom of the press and restraint on publications. He understood what the English common law had on all of the liberties of press, and Madison argued that that was inapplicable to a republic like the United States, founded on the principles that the people, not the government, possesses the absolute sovereignty. So I get what Madison was saying, and we're going to talk about a Supreme Court where it really laid that out from a case in Ohio here in a moment. But this is where you know this, who are on this program, but I don't know who else is listening to either the podcast or watching this video. But the people of America no longer understand, nor do you believe that you're the absolute sovereigns. You are the sovereigns. Instead, just look at this whole thing with the Chi-Com flu. The whole Chi-Com flu thing and the masking, and businesses as I've said before, the businesses are no different than the businesses in 1772, 74, even before that, where I called them the modern day, what? East India Trading Company. It's a new type of feudal environment. It's all about making the money and not trying to assist and provide for the needs of people that are free and living in liberty. And also is that the majority of you out there, including those that, as go look at the definition of patriotism from last week in the notes, those who call themselves patriots really aren't. Those that would say that they're citizens don't act like a free citizen. In fact, everybody is, codependent, even with the illegal aliens now, because, government checks are flowing, all the government money. Uh, Governor DeSwine here in Ohio is a filthy, and I can't insult pigs. I'm sorry. I used to raise hogs, and they're fun animals, and they're good to eat, and all of that. No, the swine is the most disparaging perspective of what you can describe as a filthy creature. He's dirty. He's got investments in all of the vaccines and mask companies and all of that. And if he doesn't, his family does. It's well known. And there's documentation here where now we know that Fauci, unequivocal, clear documentation that Fauci and Gates were in cahoots to bring this forward for all their nefarious reasons. But anyway, there's a link in there for you to take a look at. But what's important here is that you lost from the school system, its subversion since the 30s and 40s to the present day of the educational system has destroyed any concept that you have that you're a sovereign citizen. So Madison was under the impression that you would understand that, and that office holders should not violate the trust of the people. That was his expectation. And you can read this whole article here. I'm just taking bits and pieces out of this on what Madison had to say about the First Amendment. I disagree that Madison was the primary driver on the Bill of Rights. He was the one that brought it forward legislatively. But as far as being the brainchild of all of that, I've studied all the state constitutional conventions, and believe me, what came out of those conventions were what then the Bill of Rights became, okay, our first 10 amendments. So Madison introduced them, I give him credit for that, but at the same time, that what he did and what he thought in relationship to the Alien and Sedition Act, I agree that it should be up to we the people and not to limit our rights, but we don't have that moral people that he was talking about. So enough of that. Let's jump over here for a minute to that warning of Madison, where he said this, is that he goes, if Congress can employ money indefinitely for the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take the care of religion into their own hands. They may appoint teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury. They may take them into their own hands the education of children, the establishing in the like manner schools throughout the Union. They may assume the provision of the poor. Were the power of Congress to be established in the latitude contended for, it would subvert the very foundations and transmute the very nature of limited government established by the people. Wow, it's almost like, what else do I need to say? What else is there to say other than this? And this is exactly what all the governors have been doing. This is exactly the subversion that has been going on at the federal level for decades. He said subvert, subversion. Let me go back and remind you from the first segment what it is on subversion. Subversion, to subvert. He used subvert. To overthrow from the foundation, to overturn, to ruin utterly. For instance, the northern nations of Europe subverted the Roman Empire. He is the worst enemy of man who endeavors to subvert the Christian religion. The elevation of corrupt men to office will slowly but surely subvert a republican government. That was the definitions once again from our dictionary in 1828. So when we look at these last few minutes in this second segment, we're not going to get through to everything, obviously, but I do want to bring out the idea, and let me flip back over here, that we have this book that I was talking about on radically subversive speech and the authority of law. It comes to this whole interesting summation here in the last couple minutes. Indeed, our free speech tradition has been shaped in a series of encounters with speakers, anarchists, radical labor agitators, war resistors, and communists, who were understood, fairly or not, as advocating just this kind of subversive message. And when we talk about now that subversive message, the footnote here goes to Schenck versus United States, which is 249 U.S. 47, 1919, is an anti-conscription, anti-war, and anti-capitalist literature that was going out. Then again, same time, Debs versus the United States, Debs being a communist. Once again, United States 249, U.S. 211 was 1919. Anti-war speech by leading socialist. Then you have Abrams versus United States 250, U.S. 616, 1919. Pro-Russian revolution leaflets opposing U.S. military action. Gitlow versus New York, 268 U.S. 652, 1925. Left-wing manifesto advocating communist revolution and revolutionary socialism. You have Whitney versus California, 274 U.S. 357, 1927. It was about communist organizing activity. Dennis versus United States, 341 U.S. 494, 1951. Conspiracy to promote communism and to advocate the overthrow of the government. The court found in the favor, Supreme Court, found in the favor of all of these things. Those historical encounters tended to produce two things: decisions upholding restrictions on free speech and dissents containing eloquent and passionate free speech rhetoric. And that then goes into a decision that was then again in Gitlow, and where Brandy's opinion was very interesting. Then it goes on to say, in the long run, it seems that the dissents have proven more powerful than the decisions. And that is Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is the major turning point for the protection of radical speech in America. And we'll touch on that a little bit more in the third segment, because I want to cover that on the subversion, as well as a call that I got earlier this afternoon, or on Thursday afternoon actually, was where two friends of mine were almost arrested for going maskless into a store and all of that which occurred. And it's because the stores and industry is being subversive and destroying our rights. So we have to understand that. And it goes on, this decision as the Supreme Court's recent flag desecration rulings also reflect how our liberties are taking and being suppressed by the subversion in education, the subversion from the churches, the subversion in the courts. So we've been allowing decades of subversion. So then when it comes to all of the other perversions, oh well, hey, Sam Adams saw this coming. So did the Anti-Federalists. We'll touch on a couple of those here in a moment, and come on back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. Got it right. This is Tom Nivolis, your host, and welcome back all my Screaming Eagle friends there at Soaring Eagle Radio in Lima, Ohio. And we're going to jump right into it. We have tons of stuff to try and finish up in this last segment. I mentioned to you about the last segment. I'm not going to carry on about my friends that almost got arrested because of the masking in businesses, but it all goes hand in hand as now businesses, for the lust of their profits, will do what the politicians can no longer do. For instance, in Ohio, Governor DeWine is lifting the masking order, but he made it very clear that, and with bribery, that those that get their shots will be entered into a raffle, if you will, a lottery for $1 million. 5 people, $5 million. I think that's criminal, but he justified it as being federal relief money that he can use in that way. Somebody needs to run that one to ground, because I think that's criminal use of funds myself, where you're taking in, causing people to gamble, not only with their lives, because as we're seeing, there's a lot of negative effects to the shot, and I'm not getting into all of that, but at the same time, they're causing people to enter into a lottery, which is gambling. So now they're becoming an immoral proponent of gambling. Interesting. Or to take and destroy the lives potentially of young people, because if you're a young person that gets a shot, then you can possibly have a full scholarship to college. You know, that's all part of that lottery as well. See the insanities of government? And then he left the door open that, businesses can determine what they're going to want to do. And, right there is the business now becomes an agent of the government. You see? We've talked about this before. But when it comes down to subversion, what we have here is this guy by the name of Clarence Brandenburg. And some people may remember this from 1969. Some of us that are old enough to know that this went to the Supreme Court. It was Brandenburg versus Ohio, 395 U.S. 444, 1969, a landmark decision interpreting the First Amendment to the Constitution. The court held that the government cannot punish inflammatory speech unless the speech is, quote, directed to inciting, hang on, get this quote, is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and is likely to incite or produce such action. Now, I will tell you, some people are saying, well, wait a minute, then why did they go after Donald Trump for what he said on January 6th, when you have a Supreme Court decision says that whatever he said did not really incite the lawlessness, even though they tried to blame that on him? People acted on their own, because now, if you really understand what happened, that was all pre-staged in advance. But what the court did is it struck down the Ohio's criminal syndicalism statute. And that statute basically was taking and protecting against these types of left activities. And the intent was, and it was enacted back during 1919 in the first the communist movements that were happening. And we saw all of these other court cases back from 1919 and all of that occurred. And what they were saying in this Ohio law is that what the statute enacted in part was that the duty, necessity, and property of crime, sabotage, violence, or unlawful methods of terrorism as a means of accomplishing industrial or political reform and voluntary assembly with any society, group, or assemblage of persons formed to teach or advocate the doctrine of criminal syndicalism. So what was happening here is this guy, Brandenburg, obviously, those that know their history, he was a KKK leader in rural Ohio, and he was, rallying. He was doing all of his stuff down there in Hamilton County, and he got arrested for that. And the rest is history. The rest is that subversion became illegal, and not legal by law, legal by a Supreme Court decision. So when I start looking, and look, I'm going to stop right here for a second. I've got a ton of references at samueladamsreturns.net. And if you're really interested in critical race theory, if you're really interested in subversion, if you're really interested in the Ohio Revised Code on all of this, and if you're really interested in the United States Code, especially, then you need to go visit those references. So I'm just going to take you to this whole point, is that once again, the courts turn things upside down. And they've been doing that, and it goes to that warning from Jefferson. Let's see if I can find that real quick for you. Let's see, is this the Jefferson Warning? Jefferson basically warned that our government is now taking so steady a course as to show by what road it will pass to destruction, to wit, by consolidation first and then corruption. The engine of consolidation will be the federal judiciary. The two other branches, the corrupting and corrupted instruments. So when we look at the courts, once again, Jefferson was predictive on this. And he just laid it out that the judiciary would be the ones to take and cause those major issues. Now, when I look at sedition, it was talked about here by one of the anti-federalists. This one was out of the Federal Republican in March of 1788. And when he talked about sedition, he was talking about this in the fact that they will be, moreover, have the power of leading troops among you, and this is on taxation, to suppress those struggles which may sometimes happen among a free people, and which tyranny will impiously brand with the name of sedition. We have that going on right now. We have everything that's happening, and we're the true patriots are being called the seditious ones by the despotic governments in where? In Washington, D.C., as well as at the various states. So it becomes interesting. But subversion, there is some interesting commentaries on subversion, and that's starting with Robert Yates out of New York, and what some people number as anti-federalist number one is that the federalist power will ultimately subvert state authority. And just in a summation, what he says here is that you may solace yourselves with the idea that society in this favored land will fast advance to the highest point of perfection. The human mind will expand in knowledge and virtue, and the golden age will be, in some measure, realized. But if, on the other hand, this form of government contains principles that will lead to the subversion of liberty, if it tends to establish a despotism, or what is worse, a tyrannic aristocracy, then if you adopt it, this only remaining asylum for liberty, being the United States, will be shut up, and posterity will extricate your memory. Wow. Wow. Here's another one from on the guarantees of congressional voting and voting for Congress. These proposition being established, we conceive must of necessity produce the following consequences: that every constitution or system which does not quadrate with this original design is not government, but in fact a subversion of it. Then again, we have this quote here, though I'm not competent to give you a perfect explanation of the powers granted to this Department of Government, that being the courts, I shall yet attempt to trace some of the leading features of it, from which I presume it will appear that they will operate a total subversion of state judiciaries, if not to the legislative authority of the states. We've seen that over and over in the courts. We've seen that they have subverted the state courts. They've subverted state governments. And worse, we've elected people like Governor DeWine in Ohio, who have subverted the Constitution of Ohio and have instituted a form of despotism and been tyrannical. Oh, but now he's gracious. He's going to lift all of his CHICOM mandates, but he has co-conspirators, and that now is the major corporations, as well as many of the smaller ones, who will be forcing free citizens to take and muzzle up. And some businesses, if you want to keep your job, you're going to have to get shot. Ladies and gentlemen, I paused extensively there because you got to think about that. Yeah, I called this program Decades of Subversion because we have. What do we have to do to get over it? How do we get past it? Is you have to challenge every person that is running for office, every elected official that is in office, and every bureaucrat to stand on their oath that they took to uphold the Constitution of your state and the federal Constitution. And you need to get educated on both your Constitution and the federal Constitution. There's a lot of different ways of doing that. One of the ways that I am facilitating programs for the Institute on the Constitution. If you want to know more about that, you can contact me at samueladamsreturns.net. My email is there as well, and a sign-up form if you want to get more information about the programs and hear what's happening on the programs. There's many states, so the Institute on the Constitution has teams in most of the United States that are actually doing classes for you to understand your state constitution. I know that I'm part of a team here in Ohio to put a class together so that you get educated in the details of what your rights are, what your liberties are. What is it that those that get elected to office should be doing, and all of the other parameters at the state level in respect to all the taxing authorities. What can townships do? What can counties do? what are the responsibilities of all those various taxing authorities that you pay property taxes on, and that they should be what? They should be obeying the constitutions of the state first and foremost. If you're going to have a constitution, as Sam Adams said, because he was against this Constitution of 87, but what he said is, you adopted it. You, as I'm pointing to the camera, you adopted it. You live with it. You live within the framework of it. You live within the boundaries of it. Everything else is illegal. Everything else violates morality, the laws of nature, and nature's God. You know what? Come on back next week when Sam Adams, he'll take some looks into the mirrors of history, and those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right.